Hi, I'm Peter Kavanagh and welcome back to Paul and Power, Part 6. Thinking about the ministry, the supernatural ministry of the Spirit in the life of Paul. In this section, I want us to think about, just for a very short time, some of the results of Paul's ministry, with particular emphasis on the reactions of those who were in receipt of this. For example, in our first section, we were thinking about Paul's visit in Acts 14 to South Galatia, to Iconium and Lystra, where some extraordinary things were said to take place. The lame man was healed, and as a result of that, we heard that the crowd went crazy and they wanted to worship Paul and Barnabas. They wanted to sacrifice to them. The gods have come down to us in human form, they shouted. Well, here is something interesting. Paul, of course, like every man or woman of God, like every angel recorded in the scriptures, immediately says this: whatever you do, don't worship me. Don't even thank me. I didn't do this. One of the temptations that you'll face when God starts to use you in a greater way won't always be internal. It might be external. In other words, like I've known times where I've been traveling and all sorts of things have happened in the meetings, but of all the people in the room, I knew more than anyone else that it was nothing to do with me. Sometimes the meetings I held, I was so tired or ill. We've already reflected on this. And so to me, it was all the more amazing and all the more obvious that the only person doing signs and wonders was Jesus. But of course, what you'll find is that that's not always what people around you think. I remember one time I was with a friend and we visited a church and all sorts of wonderful things happened. This was in England. And at the end of the meeting, a group just sort of gathered around us, just to be with us, you know. And I remember feeling so uncomfortable. Now I know that they were excited. I know that miracles had seemed to have happened. And it had been a thrilling time. Everyone's endorphin was high. And it was right to rejoice. But I felt very uncomfortable. And I said to my mate who was with me, we need to go, and we need to go now. Because I felt that the group were giving us a little bit too much attention, a little bit too much adulation. Look, I'm just being honest with you. It wasn't that I thought that I'd done any wonderful works or that the team with me had. But the church weren't used to seeing this kind of thing. And so I felt like we were suddenly charismatic celebrities, you know. And that's just not what we are at all. And so I said to my friend, we need to go. And we immediately left. I want to encourage you that sometimes people will get very excited when they see signs and wonders. But actually, this is really just an indictment against the Western church and other places, even, further afield, just because these things aren't normally seen. And they should be. The second thing that happened in that story is that there was a riot at the end, and Paul was stoned and dragged out of the city. Folks had come from nearby Iconium, and he got himself beaten up. We don't know whether he even died and was raised back from the dead. Luke doesn't really tell us, but he certainly gives us the impression that Paul was very, very badly beaten in that occasion. Well, here's the other thing, the complete opposite thing that can happen when you see God at work in you, that people will oppose you, people will criticize you. Now, sometimes we might feel it's easier to handle things like satanic opposition or even our own psychological shortcomings, but very often it's when people criticize you that it hurts the most. And you can expect this to happen too at times, I'm afraid. Sometimes the more religious-y type people in the church, the more Pharisees, Sadducees, without being too unkind, sometimes wouldn't seize and couldn't seize, the fire extinguishers. Sometimes they don't like outward displays of the power of God. It messes with their nice, neat formulas. Now that's rare, but sometimes it happens. But of course, from the world. I've had newspapers write articles about me. I remember one time a young man came to see me from Cambridge University, a sort of an internal Cambridge University paper, but still produced many, many copies, read by, I believe, thousands of students. And I remember he came to me and I just gave an honest interview, the things that had happened. Well, when I read it, he sort of made me out to be a cult leader and a fake and a fraud and made fun of me. Listen, let's not expect the people of the world to have viewpoints the same as ours. They don't believe that miraculous things can happen, and so we are going to seem like fraudsters, even though we're not. And not to mention that sometimes, even within the sphere of Christianity as a religion, there have been fraudsters, and so perhaps it shouldn't surprise us if we get categorized along with them. Now, let's read a Bible verse, Acts 19, just before I finish today. Acts 19 and verse 11, just thinking further on about results, the things that happen after there's been a display of power. Here's one that says, God, in verse 11, God did extraordinary miracles through Paul, so that even handkerchiefs and aprons that had touched him were taken to the sick, and their illnesses were cured, and the evil spirits left them. Just a couple of things very quickly to say about this. First of all, sometimes in our charismatic world, people do pray over cloths and things and pray over handkerchiefs. It's not something I've done very often, but I've done it very, very occasionally. When you feel like you can't get to a person, but you're able to pray over something that can act as a point of contact. This shouldn't be the normal thing to happen, because this is not what normally happened in the Bible. But it happened occasionally in the Bible, so I guess we ought to say it can happen occasionally today. But here's what I think actually about the historicity of this story, what actually occurred. I don't think Paul prayed over his handkerchiefs and sent them out. I actually think what's more likely, and by the way, when we think about a handkerchief, we're talking about sweat cloths that perhaps went round his head and his waist. We're not thinking of a nice middle-class handkerchief that you blow your nose on. We're talking about rags that he would have used attached to his body. It seems to me that it's just as likely that Paul didn't know at all that these pieces of cloth were being used to minister to the sick. And so maybe this happened even without his knowledge. Well, if that's true, then that's an encouragement as well, because it means that God will sometimes use us much more powerfully than we have ever been able to know about. I really want to encourage you with that, especially if you spent some of your ministry and some of your evangelism, some of your pastoral care in praying for the sick. It's possible that God has healed or touched many more people than you'll know, because by and large, people don't really tell you. They don't really mention it. And that's another reason why, going back to a previous section, I recommend when you pray for the sick that you test much. By that I mean just see how the person is, get them to see if they can move, see if they're feeling any better. It will encourage them and it will encourage you. But if you've prayed for people and they've been healed but they never told you, well, you're not the only one. This happens quite a lot. And sometimes I'll find out years later that someone received a wonderful touch from God. Meanwhile, I'd driven home a bit down because I felt nothing had happened. So we don't always see the results of our ministry. Only heaven knows those. And that goes for all kinds of ministry, not just miraculous forms. And finally, just note this. Luke says that God did extraordinary miracles through Paul. Now again, we're speculating, but the inference seems to be that these were not ordinary, but this was extraordinary. In other words, that this didn't happen all the time. It was extra to the ordinary. Well, of course, wonderful manifestations of the Spirit, in one sense, they're never going to be ordinary. But it's like Luke was saying that something special happened in this particular season while he was in Ephesus. This may even have happened in the ministry of Jesus. Luke's Gospel, chapter 5, verse 17, Luke says this, that while Jesus was in a place teaching, the power of the Lord was present to heal. The inference being, we can't be sure, but as though this was a special occasion. There were special miracles that occurred in Luke 5:17, and the same we have here in Acts 19. There will be seasons of the extraordinary. But if that's the case, that means that we might have a few fallow years. We might have a little bit of wilderness as well, where you will seek to minister in the Spirit, but feel much more like it's a set of failures or you're not so successful. But other times, it will be extraordinary. Sometimes we don't always see the results. And sometimes there are no obvious results. Whereas other times the results are so wonderful, we're either worshipped and adored, or people hate us. Either way, note this. Your task is not to be fruitful. That's what he does. Your job and mine is to be faithful.